The ongoing national crisis in Nigeria has escalated as Dangote, a key figure in the country's oil industry, has exposed the controversial actions of the government and oil cabals. This situation, which has led to public outrage and intense discussions, underscores the power struggle and economic mismanagement affecting millions of Nigerians. Many are now questioning the intentions of those in power, including President Tinubu and Vice President Shettima, as experts like renowned economist Paul Olajay continue to criticize the handling of the nation's economy. The elite, particularly those within the current political administration, are seen by some Nigerians as deliberately exacerbating the country's economic woes. This crisis is tied to various policies and decisions, including the floating of the naira and the removal of fuel subsidies, which have sparked severe inflation, rising unemployment, and a deepening sense of economic instability. One of the most significant developments fueling this crisis involves the Dangote refinery. Initially hailed as a potential solution to Nigeria's dependence on imported fuel, the refinery's impact has been overshadowed by the actions of oil marketers and political elites. When the Dangote refinery was commissioned, many Nigerians rejoiced, believing it would lower the cost of petrol and ease the country's fuel crisis. However, their hopes were dashed as oil marketers, supported by influential cabals, rejected Dangote's petrol, claiming it was too cheap. Instead, they opted to continue importing fuel at higher costs, thereby inflating prices for ordinary Nigerians. In response, Dangote revealed the disturbing reality behind the situation. Despite being capable of producing fuel locally, the refinery has been forced to export much of its products, as local marketers refuse to purchase fuel at the lower rates offered. The price of Dangote's diesel, which started at 1,200 naira per liter, dropped to 900 naira per liter, but this was still deemed too low by oil marketers, who prefer to import fuel and sell it at exorbitant prices. The marketers' actions have sparked outrage, as many Nigerians believe that this decision is motivated by greed and a desire to maintain the high cost of living for the population. Dangote himself has expressed frustration, stating that if the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, NNPC, and local marketers continue to reject his refinery's products, he will have no choice but to export to international markets. This could lead to a significant shift in Nigeria's fuel supply and pricing dynamics, further straining the country's economy. Shettima. Adding to the controversy, Vice President Shettima recently claimed that Nigeria's macroeconomic environment had stabilized, a statement that was swiftly debunked by experts like Paul Olajay pointed to the country's inflation rates, which have skyrocketed to over 33% for headline inflation and nearly 40% for food inflation. He also noted the massive depreciation of the naira, with the exchange rate worsening by 100% over the past year. These figures directly contradict Shettima's optimistic outlook, painting a grim picture of Nigeria's economic health. Olajay's critique highlights a broader issue: the government's reluctance to address the real causes of Nigeria's economic challenges. The floating of the naira, alongside the removal of subsidies, has left many Nigerians struggling to make ends meet. While the government insists that these policies are necessary for long-term growth, the immediate impact has been devastating for the average citizen. The root of this crisis lies in the entrenched power of oil marketers and political elites, who have long controlled Nigeria's oil industry for their own benefit. These individuals, many of whom are former high-ranking officials or close associates of the current administration, wield significant influence over fuel prices and supply chains. Their refusal to engage with Dangote's refinery is seen by many as a deliberate attempt to maintain their monopoly over the oil market, even if it means pushing Nigerians further into poverty. Critics argue that this situation exemplifies the broader culture of corruption that has plagued Nigeria for decades. Policies aimed at improving the country's economic situation are often undermined by vested interests, and any attempts to introduce transparency or accountability are quickly thwarted by powerful elites. This lack of political will to implement meaningful reforms is seen as one of the main reasons Nigeria continues to struggle with widespread poverty, unemployment, and economic instability. As the crisis deepens, Nigerians are calling for action. Many have taken to social media to express their frustration, with some even suggesting that Dangote should bypass the marketers altogether by establishing his own network of filling stations across the country. This, they argue, would allow him to sell fuel directly to Nigerians at more reasonable prices, thereby reducing the influence of the oil cabals and providing some relief to the country's beleaguered population. Despite these calls for change, it remains unclear whether the government is willing or able to take the necessary steps to address the crisis. The relationship between the political class and the oil industry is deeply intertwined, and any attempt to disrupt this dynamic would likely face significant resistance from those who benefit from the status quo. Nonetheless, the growing public outcry suggests that Nigerians are no longer willing to tolerate a system that prioritizes the interests of the elite over the needs of the people. In conclusion, the current crisis in Nigeria, fueled by the actions of oil marketers and political elites, has exposed the deep-rooted corruption and mismanagement that continues to plague the country. While the Dangote refinery was initially seen as a potential solution to Nigeria's fuel crisis, its impact has been undermined by the refusal of local marketers to engage with it. This situation, coupled with the government's flawed economic policies, has led to skyrocketing inflation, a devalued currency, and widespread suffering for the Nigerian people. As the crisis unfolds, it is clear that meaningful change will only come if the people demand it, and if the government is willing to break the stranglehold of the oil cabals on the nation's economy. Nigeria is currently facing a heavy national crisis, one that stretches far beyond economic instability. It has reached a point where national icons like Alikeo Dangote are exposing the deep-seated corruption within the government and oil cabals, particularly the damaging decisions made by President Tinubu, Vice President Shettima, and their allies. The exposure of these manipulative practices not only underscores a deteriorating economic condition, but also sparks outrage and frustration from millions of Nigerians who feel betrayed by their leaders. In this analysis, we will dissect the causes, impact, and potential solutions to this ongoing crisis, breaking down the complexities for easier understanding. At the heart of this crisis is Dangote, a figure known for his contributions to Nigeria's economic growth. Dangote's refinery was originally hailed as a breakthrough that would reduce Nigeria's dependency on imported fuel. The expectation was that locally produced fuel would be cheaper and more accessible, alleviating pressure on the already burdened population. Yet, what unfolded instead was a disturbing revelation. Oil marketers and cabals, with close ties to the government, rejected Dangote's offer to sell petrol at a lower price. Their refusal stems not from concerns about quality or availability, but from sheer greed and a desire to keep prices high. This has escalated into a national outcry. Nigerians, who hoped that the Dangote refinery would ease their financial woes, now find themselves further impoverished by a government that seemingly supports these unscrupulous oil marketers. The refusal to engage with Dangote's refinery exposes the intricate web of corruption where power, politics, and profit collide, keeping the average Nigerian in a cycle of suffering. Fuel prices are just one aspect of a much larger economic disaster. The Nigerian economy is currently grappling with severe inflation, worsened by the government's decision to float the naira and remove fuel subsidies. These policies, though presented as measures for long-term growth, have caused an immediate rise in the cost of living, plunging millions into deeper poverty. Experts like economist Paul Olajay have painted a grim picture, citing that Nigeria's inflation rate has skyrocketed to over 33%, with food inflation reaching nearly 40%. This figure sharply contrasts with Vice President Shettima's claims of a stabilized macroeconomic environment, exposing how disconnected the government is from reality. The naira's devaluation, doubling in just a year, means that the average Nigerian's purchasing power has plummeted. A loaf of bread or a gallon of fuel now costs significantly more, yet wages remain stagnant. This growing economic instability is leaving people questioning the government's motives and competence, as well as the elite class that continues to thrive while the masses suffer. Critics argue that Nigeria's ongoing crisis highlights a systemic issue, one of corruption and monopolistic control by oil cabals. These elites have long been the gatekeepers of the country's oil resources, benefiting from inflated prices while controlling supply chains. The fact that these cabals can reject Dangote's fuel, which is cheaper and locally produced, shows how much power they wield. Their control over the fuel industry allows them to manipulate prices, ensuring they profit at the expense of the wider population. This kind of power imbalance, where a few elites have more influence than the needs of millions of Nigerians, has been Nigeria's Achilles heel for decades. Policy changes meant to reduce the dominance of these cabals are either stalled or blocked entirely by political figures who benefit from maintaining the status quo. This cycle of corruption has left the Nigerian people feeling disenfranchised, with little hope for reform under the current leadership. Despite the clear evidence of economic mismanagement, the government continues to claim that their policies are for the good of the nation. This attitude creates a further disconnect between the ruling class and the general public. The floating of the naira, for instance, has not led to the economic growth promised by the government. Instead, it has led to spiraling inflation and a dramatic rise in unemployment. The removal of fuel subsidies, rather than providing long-term stability, has left Nigerians paying even more for basic necessities like transportation and food. The government's failure to address the root causes of Nigeria's economic challenges is evident. While leaders like Shettima claim that the macroeconomic environment has stabilized, the reality on the ground tells a very different story. This government's unwillingness or inability to enact meaningful reform has left the Nigerian economy in shambles, further fueling public anger and disillusionment. In the face of this crisis, there is growing support for Dangote to take matters into his own hands by creating his own network of filling stations across the country. Many Nigerians believe that by bypassing the oil marketers, Dangote could sell fuel directly to consumers at more affordable prices. This could potentially weaken the stranglehold that the oil cabals have over the market, providing some much-needed relief to the general public. However, even if Dangote were to follow through with such a plan, he would undoubtedly face significant opposition from the cabals and political elites. Their control over the fuel industry is entrenched, and any attempt to break this monopoly would likely be met with fierce resistance. Still, the growing public outcry suggests that Nigerians are ready for change, and Dangote's direct involvement in fuel distribution could serve as a catalyst for broader reform. Critics argue that the Nigerian government is complicit in this crisis. By allowing oil marketers and cabals to manipulate prices and reject Dangote's fuel, the government has shown where its loyalties lie, with the elites, not the people. This situation is a reflection of broader systemic corruption, where policies that could benefit the masses are sabotaged to maintain the wealth and power of a few. The refusal to engage with Dangote's refinery is symbolic of the wider dysfunction within Nigeria's political system. Critics call for a complete overhaul of how the government regulates the oil industry, demanding greater transparency and accountability. Without these changes, they argue, Nigeria's economic crisis will only deepen, with ordinary citizens bearing the brunt of the pain. The government must prioritize the needs of the people over the interests of oil cabals. This means implementing policies that break up monopolistic control over the oil industry, ensuring that locally produced fuel is available and affordable. There needs to be greater transparency in how decisions are made regarding the oil industry and the economy. The public deserves to know why certain policies are implemented and who stands to benefit from them. Supporting figures like Dangote, who have the capacity to create competition in the oil market, could lead to lower prices and greater access to fuel for Nigerians. Nigeria's current crisis is a clear indicator that the country is at a crossroads. The exposure of the corruption within the oil industry, as well as the government's failure to address the root causes of the economic crisis, highlights the need for drastic reform. If these issues are not addressed, the country risks falling deeper into economic instability with devastating consequences for its citizens. This is the end of our news update. Your comments and opinions will help shape this ongoing discussion. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day.